The Boulton Paul Defiant was one of Britain's most humiliating fighter ideas. And for a brief moment, it looked like a clever one. A powered turret, 4.303 machine guns, and a fighter that did not need to point its nose at the enemy to kill it. On paper, that sounded modern. Then the summer of 1940 arrived, and the idea collapsed almost as soon as real combat tested it. On July 19th, No. 141 Squadron sent 9 Defiants into action near Folkestone and lost 6. Once Luftwaffe pilots realized the aircraft had no forward-firing guns, they attacked from ahead and below, and the whole concept came apart in public. The RAF Museum says it plainly. During the Battle of Britain, the Defiant proved no match for German fighters and was quickly withdrawn from daylight operations. Even today, its reputation in aviation circles still carries the same sting. It worked only until the enemy understood what it was. Britain did not drift into that mistake by accident. The Hawker Hotspur stood on the same road. It was another turret fighter built around the same broad idea and aimed at the same sort of RAF requirement. It first flew on June 14, 1938, but by then the concept was already losing momentum. Only one prototype was completed, and even that machine first flew with a wooden mock-up turret and ballast instead of the real installation. It never had to embarrass itself in combat, because the Defiant got there first and did the job for both of them. That is what makes the Hotspur useful in this story. It proves Britain was not casually experimenting. It was investing in a whole line of thinking that was already beginning to betray it. The Fleet Air Arm took the same mistake and somehow made it slower. The Blackburn Roc was the naval version of Britain's turret fighter obsession, and it inherited all the wrong qualities. It could manage only about 223 miles per hour, carried the same 4-gun turret arrangement, and entered service at exactly the wrong moment for a carrier fighter built around compromise. It did record one confirmed aerial victory, but that lonely success only stands out because there was so little else to point to. By late 1940, the Roc had already been pushed away from meaningful frontline fighter work and toward rescue, training, and target towing duties. That is why the aircraft still shows up in enthusiast discussions as a byword for a bad idea taken too far. People do not remember it as an underrated secret. They remember it as the point where the turret fighter fantasy became impossible to defend. Those early embarrassments pushed British fighter thinking back towards something less ambitious and much more urgent: survival. The Miles M20 was born out of panic, not confidence. In 1940, Britain had to consider the nightmare possibility that Hurricane and Spitfire production might be damaged badly enough to create a genuine frontline shortage. The M20 was the emergency answer to that fear. It was designed, built, and flown in just over 9 weeks, carried 12.303 machine guns, and packed 154 imperial gallons of fuel, more range and ammunition than some frontline fighters already in service. Its performance sat between the Hurricane and the Spitfire, which made it far more serious than its stopgap image suggests. But the emergency it was built for never fully arrived. British dispersed manufacturing held together. The Luftwaffe did not destroy fighter output, and the M20 became one of the strangest failed fighters in British history, a machine built for disaster, cancelled because Britain survived one. Then Britain ran into a different kind of failure, the kind where the aircraft itself looks promising, but reality keeps strangling it. That is where the Westland Whirlwind enters the story. It had the shape of a serious success, around 360 miles per hour, for 20mm Hispano cannon in the nose, and enough punch to make a pilot feel very well armed indeed. It did fight, too. RAF squadrons flew it on escort, anti-shipping, and low-level rhubarb operations, and the type scored real kills. Pilots often liked it, and even now enthusiasts talk about it less like a joke and more like a missed opportunity. That tells you everything. The problem was the Rolls-Royce Peregrine engine. Development stalled, production stayed limited, and only 114 were built before the aircraft was effectively trapped by its own power plant. The Whirlwind's modern reputation is not what a disaster. It is what a waste. The next Westland fighter failed in a colder way. The Westland Welkin was built for a problem that was already fading by the time the aircraft was ready. It was a high-altitude fighter with long-span wings, a service ceiling around 44,000 feet, and enough firepower to make sense against extreme altitude intruders. Britain wanted something that could reach aircraft operating above the normal fight. By the time the Welkin entered service in May 1944, though, the Luftwaffe was no longer presenting that threat in the same way. 77 were completed, another 26 were left as engineless airframes, and the aircraft never saw real operational combat. It served briefly with the Fighter Interception Unit to develop high-altitude tactics, and then mostly disappeared. The Welkin does not feel like a stupid airplane. It feels like a very serious answer to a question that had stopped being urgent. The Fleet Air Arm's next disappointment dragged on for years, which made it worse. The Blackburn Firebrand started life as a carrier fighter and ended up drifting into a strike role because the original idea refused to behave. It first flew on February 27, 1942, and the requirement behind it had called for something close to 400 miles per hour. What Britain got instead was delay, redesign, and frustration. Napier Sabre engines went to more urgent aircraft like the Hawker Typhoon, performance fell short, and the Firebrand gradually became more convincing as a load carrier than as a true fighter. In all, 220 production aircraft and 3 prototypes were built, but the first production examples reached a frontline squadron only in September 1945, after the war had already ended. Test pilot Eric Brown later described it as short on performance and sadly lacking in maneuverability. That judgment has lingered. The Firebrand was not one dramatic collapse. It was a long, stubborn slide away from what it had promised to be. Then Britain entered the jet age and somehow made even that look uneasy. The Supermarine Attacker was one of the Royal Navy's first operational jet fighters, and that should have made it look like a clean new beginning. Instead, it arrived with the posture of a compromise. It first flew in 1946, entered service in 1950-51, and still used a tailwheel undercarriage inherited from piston-era thinking. That alone made carrier operations more awkward than they needed to be. Aviation writers noted another telling detail. The Attacker's jet exhaust could tear up the surface behind it badly enough that the tailpipe had to be canted upward. It was historically important, yes, but the importance feels rough-edged. In aviation circles, it is remembered less as Britain's first elegant naval jet and more as proof that Britain entered the jet age carrying too much of the old age with it. The real public embarrassment came next. The Supermarine Swift did not fail quietly inside reports and committee papers. It failed where everyone could see it. Entering RAF service in 1954, the Swift was supposed to help represent Britain's swept-wing future. Instead, accidents and technical faults piled up with brutal speed. A Swift F-1 crashed on May 13, 1954, killing its pilot, and another major crash later that year helped ground the fleet again, while handling and control problems were investigated. By early 1955, the type had become what later writers openly called a national scandal, damaging the reputations of the RAF, the government, and the British aircraft industry all at once. Enthusiast discussions still treat the Swift less like an ordinary failed aircraft and more like a cautionary tale about rushing, politics, and industrial overconfidence. It later found some redemption in reconnaissance form and in speed records, but that only makes the fighter story more painful. The promise was real. The public humiliation was real too. The last British fighter on this list looks like tomorrow, which is why it works so well as an ending. The Saunders-Roe SR.53 was a mixed-power interceptor, jet engine, rocket motor, steep climb, and a mission shaped by the fear of fast, high-altitude attack. It first flew in May 1957. Only 2 prototypes were completed, and together they carried out 56 test flights. On paper, that does not sound humiliating at all. In the air, the aircraft proved it could fly. On the drawing board, it looked like the future. But history moved faster than the program did. The 1957 Defense White Paper changed British priorities dramatically. Guided missiles were gaining favor, and the strategic need for a manned mixed-power interceptor was shrinking. Then one of the 2 prototypes was lost in June 1958, killing test pilot John Booth. By 1960, the program was over. The SR-53 still haunts British aviation culture for the same reason it belongs on this list. It looked modern enough to fascinate, but not necessary enough to survive. Britain's failures were awkward enough. Across the Atlantic, America's fighter history suffered plenty of ugly missteps of its own. Click the video and watch the moments when American fighter development went badly wrong.